Morning. Passport.
Here you go.
Purpose of your visit?
Official diplomatic travel.
Diplomatic, right. I'm going to be honest, you don't really look like someone traveling on a diplomatic passport.
I beg your pardon?
People with passports like this usually come through here looking a little more official.
Is there a problem with my passport?
Morning light spilled through the tall glass walls of Terminal B, stretching across polished airport floors and long lines of travelers waiting for immigration clearance. The steady rhythm of rolling suitcases, distant boarding announcements, and the soft mechanical beep of passport scanners blended into the background like white noise. For most passengers arriving after long international flights, the checkpoint was the final obstacle before they could breathe again. Behind one of the immigration desks stood Officer Daniel Mercer. He had worked border control long enough to develop what he liked to call instincts. Years of watching faces, scanning documents, and reading body language had convinced him that nervous travelers almost always meant one thing: something was wrong. And when the next passenger stepped forward, Mercer noticed it immediately. She appeared composed on the surface, professionally dressed, posture straight, her carry-on resting neatly beside her. But there was something subtle in her expression, a slight hesitation in her movement, a brief tightening around her eyes. To Mercer, that was enough. "Passport," he said, extending his hand across the counter. The woman handed it over politely. Up close, the document looked unusually official. Dark navy cover, crisp edges, the kind of passport that suggested government travel or high-level clearance. Mercer opened it slowly. His eyes skimmed the first page, then the second, then the visas. He paused. The scanning machine beeped softly as he slid the passport under the reader. A thin green light moved across the page as the system began verifying the data. Normally, the process took only a few seconds. This time, Mercer leaned closer to the screen. His expression changed. The woman stood quietly on the other side of the counter, hands folded, waiting with patient stillness that contrasted sharply with the growing tension behind the desk. Mercer looked up briefly, then back down at the passport. Something about this traveler was making him uneasy. Not the document itself, at least not yet, but the combination of her calmness and the way the system seemed to hesitate. He tapped the desk lightly with his finger as the verification continued. Behind her, the line of passengers shifted forward. People adjusted their bags and checked their phones, unaware that this ordinary checkpoint interaction was already beginning to stretch longer than usual. Mercer flipped to another page. A seal caught his eye. He frowned slightly. Most travelers wouldn't recognize the symbol, but Mercer had seen enough documents to know it wasn't common. Still, something didn't sit right with him. His instincts were buzzing now, and instincts, he believed, had saved him from overlooking problems more than once before. Before we go further, a quick question for you. What city are you watching from today? Drop it in the comments below. It's always fascinating to see how far these stories travel around the world. And if you believe that authority should always be held accountable when power is misused, consider subscribing, because the story you're about to see is exactly the kind of moment where power and responsibility collide. Now back to the checkpoint. Mercer lifted the passport again, turning it slowly beneath the overhead lights. The traveler remained calm. Too calm, in his opinion. "Is this your first time entering the country?" he asked. Her voice was steady when she answered. "Yes." No hesitation, no defensive tone, just simple confirmation. Mercer narrowed his eyes slightly. Then he looked again at the screen. The verification system had finally finished loading, but instead of a quick confirmation he expected, a small notification box appeared, one that required additional review. Mercer leaned back in his chair. Something about this traveler suddenly felt less routine, and as he closed the passport slowly, his instincts told him this wasn't going to be a normal clearance. "Ma'am," he said, his tone sharpening just slightly, "I'm going to need to take a closer look at this." Officer Mercer turned the passport once more in his hands, examining the cover as if it might reveal something the scanner had missed. The line behind the traveler shifted impatiently, but he ignored it. When something felt off, he believed it was better to slow things down than rush through a mistake. The woman across the counter remained still. Her posture was relaxed, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the immigration desk. She didn't appear worried, didn't ask questions, didn't try to hurry the process the way many travelers did after long flights. That calmness only made Mercer more suspicious. Most people, when stopped for additional checks at a border checkpoint, showed at least some sign of discomfort, restless movements, nervous glances, a hint of anxiety in their voice. This woman showed none of it. Mercer flipped open the passport again and studied the page with her photograph. He glanced up at her face, then back down, then up again. The resemblance was clear enough, but something about the document still made him uneasy. The seal he had noticed earlier stood out again, pressed sharply into the paper with official precision. It wasn't a seal he saw often. Mercer leaned back slightly in his chair and let out a quiet breath. "Interesting passport," he said, his voice carrying just enough volume for the nearby travelers to hear. A few people in the line looked up from their phones. The woman didn't respond. Instead, she simply waited. Mercer tapped the passport lightly against the desk. "You know," he continued, tilting the document in the air, "we see a lot of different passports come through here." He paused, letting the moment stretch. "Some real," he added, "and some not so real." The comment hung in the air. A man standing 2 places back in the line glanced toward the counter. Another traveler adjusted her bag and looked over Mercer's shoulder at the desk. The checkpoint was beginning to attract attention. The woman finally spoke. "Is there a problem with my document, officer?" Her voice was calm, polite even. Mercer raised an eyebrow slightly. "Problem?" he repeated, leaning forward again. "Well, that's what I'm trying to figure out." He turned the passport toward the light again and pointed at the seal. "This," he said, tapping it lightly, "is not something we see on everyday travel documents." The woman nodded once. "That's correct." Mercer waited for more explanation. None came. Behind her, the line shifted again. Someone cleared their throat, but Mercer had already committed to the moment. When an officer showed doubt, backing down too quickly could make it seem like the inspection had been careless from the start. So he doubled down. "Where exactly did you say you were traveling from?" he asked. She answered immediately. Mercer typed the information into his system again, even though the information was already in the database. His eyes moved back to the screen. The verification notification was still sitting there, waiting for manual review. That alone wasn't unusual, but combined with the unusual seal and the traveler's steady composure, it was enough to keep his suspicions alive. Mercer closed the passport halfway and rested it on the desk. "You're seeming awfully calm," he said. The woman tilted her head slightly. "Should I be worried?" The corner of Mercer's mouth tightened. "Depends." "On what?" she asked. He tapped the passport again. "On whether this document is exactly what it claims to be." Another passenger in line leaned slightly to the side, trying to catch a glimpse of the exchange. The checkpoint had grown noticeably quieter. Mercer turned the passport back towards himself. Then he reached for a small form beside the scanner, the one used for additional verification requests. As he began filling it out, he looked up again. "Ma'am," he said, "I'm going to need to ask you to step to secondary screening." And the moment those words left his mouth, the routine checkpoint interaction quietly crossed a line that would soon draw far more attention than Mercer ever expected. The atmosphere changed the moment Officer Mercer mentioned secondary screening. At a busy international airport, most travelers knew what that meant. It wasn't an arrest, and it didn't automatically imply wrongdoing, but it was rarely a good sign. Secondary inspection was where documents were examined more closely, where databases were searched deeper, and where small suspicions could quickly grow into official problems. Mercer stood up from his chair and gestured toward a partitioned inspection area a few steps from the main line. "This way," he said. The woman picked up her carry-on and followed without protest. Behind them, the line of passengers quietly resumed moving forward as another officer opened a neighboring station. But several travelers still glanced toward the side inspection desk where Mercer now placed the passport carefully beneath a brighter overhead lamp. Secondary inspection areas were intentionally designed to feel more controlled. The lighting was sharper, the counters were wider, the computer systems had access to deeper verification databases that normal frontline scanners couldn't always reach. Mercer sat down again and opened the passport fully. "Place your bag here," he instructed, pointing to the inspection surface. The woman did as asked. No hesitation, no argument, no visible concern. Mercer noticed that, too. Most people entering secondary screening immediately began explaining themselves, offering documents, asking questions, trying to convince officers the delay was unnecessary. This traveler simply waited. He entered her passport number into a more detailed verification system. The screen filled with loading bars and encrypted data fields. Government networks often took longer to respond, especially when cross-referencing international records. Mercer drummed his fingers lightly on the desk while the system processed. His suspicion hadn't faded. If anything, the quiet compliance from the traveler was only making him more certain that something unusual was going on. "Purpose of travel?" he asked again, his tone more formal now. She met his eyes. "Official business." Mercer typed the words into the system. The response box appeared immediately. He frowned slightly. "Official business." That phrase appeared often enough in international travel forms, but it usually... Government letters, diplomatic clearances, corporate credentials. He looked at the counter. No extra documents, just the passport. "You don't have any supporting paperwork?" he asked. The woman shook her head once. "The passport should be sufficient." Mercer leaned back in his chair. "Should be," he repeated. The verification screen flickered again as another system began loading. Behind the traveler, a glass wall separated the inspection area from the terminal. Through it, Mercer could see airport staff moving luggage carts and passengers heading toward connecting flights. Everything outside the room felt normal. Inside, the tension was slowly tightening. He flipped to another page of the passport and studied the stamps. Several recent international entries, all legitimate, all properly documented, and that same unusual seal appearing again. Mercer leaned forward. He pulled the passport closer. Then he opened a separate authentication tool used specifically for detecting counterfeit security markings. The scanner passed over the seal. A green line moved across the page. Mercer waited for the alert, but none appeared. The system showed no sign of forgery. Still, the verification database in the corner of his screen had not fully completed its cross-check yet. He folded his hands together on the desk. "You understand," he said, looking up again, "that presenting an invalid passport at an international checkpoint is a serious offense." The woman's expression didn't change. "I understand." Mercer studied her face carefully. Most travelers would defend themselves immediately when hearing that statement. She didn't. She simply waited. And the longer she stayed calm, the more Mercer began to interpret it as confidence. Confidence that didn't quite make sense for someone whose document he still believed might be questionable. The verification system suddenly refreshed. A new notification box appeared on the screen. Mercer's eyes moved quickly across the message. His expression tightened slightly. He looked back at the traveler, then at the passport again, then back to the screen. For a moment, he said nothing. Finally, he reached for a small radio clipped to his belt. "Control," he said quietly into it. "I'm going to need a document verification review at secondary desk 3. He placed the radio down. Then he looked directly at the woman. "Until we confirm a few things," he said, his voice firmer now, "you'll need to remain here." What Mercer didn't realize yet was that the very verification process he had just triggered was about to bring someone into the room who knew far more about that passport than he did.
The secondary inspection area had grown noticeably quieter. A moment earlier, the room carried the usual background noise of keyboards, scanners, and officers speaking with travelers. Now, most of that activity seemed to fade as Officer Mercer leaned forward behind the desk, his attention locked firmly on the passport in front of him. The traveler remained standing calmly on the opposite side of the counter. Her carry-on bag rested beside her feet. Her hands were lightly folded in front of her, fingers relaxed, posture steady. If the situation unsettled her, she didn't show it. Mercer noticed that, and the longer he studied her composure, the more it reinforced the suspicion building in his mind. People who had nothing to hide usually reacted differently when their documents were questioned. They asked questions, they offered explanations, they became defensive. This woman had done none of those things. Instead, she had answered only what was asked and allowed the process to continue. To Mercer, that kind of restraint felt less like cooperation and more like someone carefully choosing their words. He tapped the passport once more against the desk. "You said you're here on official business," he began. "That's correct," the woman replied. Mercer nodded slowly. "Official for who?" The question hung in the air for a moment. The woman paused before answering. "Government-related travel." Mercer raised an eyebrow. "That's pretty vague." Her expression didn't shift. "I can provide more detail if necessary." Mercer leaned back slightly in his chair, folding his arms. "Well," he said, "that might be necessary if your passport turns out not to check out." The words were delivered casually, but the implication behind them was serious. Across the room, another officer glanced up briefly before returning to his workstation. The traveler remained still. "Are you suggesting there's an issue with it?" she asked. Mercer opened the passport again and rotated it slowly across the desk so the seal faced upward. "This symbol right here," he said, tapping it with the end of his pen. "It's not something we see on standard travel documents." The woman looked down at the page briefly. Then she looked back at him. "That's correct." Mercer waited. But again, no further explanation came. He exhaled slowly through his nose. "You're being awfully comfortable for someone whose document is currently under review." The woman tilted her head slightly. "I'm comfortable because I know my documents are legitimate." Mercer gave a small, skeptical laugh. "Everyone says that." He reached toward the computer again and refreshed the verification window. The same notification remained on the screen, indicating that a higher-level document authentication request was still pending. The system hadn't flagged the passport as fake, but it hadn't cleared it either. To Mercer, that was enough uncertainty to justify pushing further. He closed the passport firmly. "Here's the situation," he said. "When we encounter travel documents that don't match expected patterns, we're required to investigate." The woman nodded once. "I understand." Mercer studied her again. The calm tone, the steady posture, no visible stress. If anything, it seemed as though she was waiting patiently for something to happen. That patience irritated him more than he expected. He reached for a printed form from the side drawer of his desk. "This is a preliminary notice," he explained, placing it on the counter. "It means your entry clearance is temporarily suspended until we verify the authenticity of your passport." The woman glanced at the form. "And how long will that take?" Mercer shrugged slightly. "Depends on how long it takes to confirm where this document actually came from." The implication was unmistakable now. Mercer wasn't just questioning the passport. He was openly suggesting it might be fraudulent. Behind the glass wall of the inspection area, 2 airport staff members slowed their walk, noticing the tone of the exchange. Mercer picked up his pen and began filling out the report. "You understand," he added, "that presenting false government credentials can carry serious legal consequences." The woman's voice remained level. "My credentials are not false." Mercer continued writing. "That's what we're going to find out." The radio on his desk crackled softly as the verification request continued moving through the system. Mercer barely looked at it. At that moment, he felt certain he was doing exactly what his job required. Question the document, push for answers, verify every detail. What he didn't realize was that somewhere in the airport's internal database, a different alert had already begun moving toward the secondary inspection room, an alert that would soon bring someone through the door who recognized that passport instantly. The energy in the secondary inspection area had changed. What had started as a quiet document check was slowly turning into something more noticeable. Beyond the glass partition, travelers moving through the terminal occasionally glanced toward the inspection desks.
Most continued on their way, but a few slowed their pace, sensing the tension building in the room. Inside the inspection area, 2 other officers worked nearby, though their attention now drifted occasionally toward Mercer's desk. The woman remained standing calmly. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't argued. She hadn't demanded an explanation. Instead, she simply watched as Mercer slid the completed form across the counter. "This notice just confirms that your entry clearance is under review," he said. She glanced down at the document. "And until that review is finished?" she asked. "You remain in secondary inspection," Mercer replied. Her expression stayed neutral. For Mercer, that continued composure was becoming harder to interpret. Most travelers at this stage would be asking how long the delay might last, whether they could contact someone, or whether there was a misunderstanding that could be cleared up quickly. This woman seemed almost patient, as if the outcome of the inspection didn't concern her. Mercer turned back toward his computer and refreshed the verification system again. Still processing. The higher-level authentication request he had triggered earlier was now running through additional databases, government clearance records, international credential registries, and security documentation systems that normal passport checks rarely accessed. Those systems often took time, but Mercer was convinced the delay meant the system was struggling to verify the passport, which, in his mind, only supported his suspicion. "You said this trip is government-related," he said, not looking up from the screen. "That's correct." "Then you must have a contact person here," he continued. "I do." Mercer glanced up. "And who would that be?" The woman paused briefly. "You." Mercer blinked once. "I'm sorry?" "You are the assigned officer," she said calmly. Mercer let out a short laugh. "Right," he said dismissively, turning back to the computer. "I don't think so." Behind the traveler, one of the other officers at the neighboring desk shifted slightly in his chair, glancing toward Mercer with mild curiosity. Mercer ignored the look. At that moment, he was convinced the traveler was simply trying to sound confident while the system worked through verification. And he had seen that tactic before. People attempting to bluff their way through border inspections often relied on vague references to official contacts or government connections. It rarely worked. Mercer closed the passport again and placed it beside the keyboard. "Well, if I'm supposedly your contact, then this should be easy to clear up." The woman didn't respond. She simply waited. Across the room, a door opened quietly as another officer stepped into the inspection area. He carried a small tablet used for internal verification checks. Mercer noticed him only briefly. The officer approached the desk and glanced down at the passport. His eyes paused for a fraction of a second longer than expected. Then he looked up at Mercer. "Is this the document you requested verification on?" he asked. Mercer nodded. "That's the one." The officer picked up the passport carefully and opened it to the identification page. The moment his eyes landed on the seal Mercer had questioned earlier, his expression shifted, just slightly, but enough to signal recognition. He looked back at Mercer, then toward the traveler, then down at the passport again. "What exactly is the issue here?" he asked. Mercer gestured casually toward the document. "The seal's unusual, and the system's taking longer than it should to verify it." The officer didn't answer immediately. Instead, he studied the passport one more time. Then he slowly turned his head toward Mercer again. And in that brief pause before he spoke, something in his expression suggested that the situation Mercer believed he was investigating was about to change in a way he hadn't anticipated. The officer who had just stepped into the secondary inspection area didn't immediately speak. Instead, he continued studying the passport in his hands, his eyes moving slowly across the page. The room had grown noticeably still around Mercer's desk, as if the moment had quietly pulled everyone's attention toward it. Officer Mercer leaned back slightly in his chair, watching him. "What?" Mercer asked after a moment. "Something wrong with it?" The man didn't answer right away. He rotated the passport under the overhead inspection light, examining the seal Mercer had pointed out earlier. The embossed marking caught the light at a precise angle, revealing a level of detail that most counterfeit documents struggled to replicate. After another second, he looked up. "Where did you say you got this?" he asked the traveler. The woman answered calmly. "It was issued through official diplomatic channels." Mercer scoffed softly. "That's what she claims." The officer's eyes shifted toward Mercer again. "You already contacted verification?" Mercer nodded and gestured toward the screen. "Still processing." The officer stepped closer to the desk and glanced at the monitor. The verification window was still open, the loading indicator turning quietly as the system completed its deeper checks. He looked back down at the passport again. Then he flipped to another page, another seal, another signature. His expression changed again, though subtly. Mercer noticed it this time. "You recognize something?" Mercer asked. The officer didn't respond directly. Instead, he asked another question. "Did you check the escort schedule this morning?" Mercer frowned slightly. "The what?" "The escort schedule," the officer repeated. Mercer shook his head. "No, why would I?" The officer closed the passport halfway and rested it on the desk. "That's interesting." Mercer leaned forward. "What is?" The officer glanced briefly at the traveler again before turning back toward Mercer. "Because this seal," he said, tapping the page lightly, "is used on a very specific type of diplomatic passport." Mercer folded his arms. "Which is?" The officer hesitated for a moment. Then he spoke carefully. "One that usually belongs to someone arriving here on official state business." Mercer shrugged. "Lots of people travel on official business." "Yes," the officer replied, "they do." He turned the passport again and flipped back to the identification page. His eyes paused on the name. Then he looked up slowly toward the traveler. The room felt quieter than before. "Ma'am," he said politely, "could you confirm your full name for me?" The woman did. Mercer watched the exchange with mild impatience. "What difference does that make?" he asked. The officer didn't answer right away. Instead, he picked up the small tablet he had brought with him and began typing something into it. The screen glowed faintly as he navigated through an internal database. Mercer waited. The traveler remained still. After a few seconds, the officer stopped typing. He looked back down at the passport again. Then he looked toward Mercer. "Officer," he said quietly, "did you receive the briefing packet about today's diplomatic arrivals?" Mercer frowned again. "I skimmed it." The officer nodded slowly. "You might want to take another look." Mercer leaned back in his chair, now clearly irritated. "Why?" The officer held the passport in the air slightly. "Because if this document is what I think it is—" He paused. Then he looked toward the traveler one more time. "Then the person standing at your desk right now isn't just another international passenger." Mercer stared at him. "What are you talking about?" The officer didn't answer right away. Instead, he placed the passport carefully back on the counter. Then he reached for the radio clipped to his shoulder. And as his thumb moved toward the transmit button, Mercer had the sudden feeling that the routine document check he had started only minutes earlier was about to trigger a chain reaction far bigger than he had expected. The moment the officer reached for his radio, the tension in the inspection room shifted again. Officer Mercer noticed it immediately. Up until now, he had been the one directing the situation, asking questions, reviewing documents, controlling the pace of the inspection. But the quiet hesitation in his colleague's voice and the careful way he handled the passport suggested that something had changed. Mercer leaned forward slightly. "What exactly is going on?" he asked. The other officer didn't answer right away. Instead, he pressed the radio button. "Supervisor to Secondary Inspection Desk 3. he said calmly. There was a brief pause before a voice responded over the radio. Go ahead. We need confirmation on a diplomatic arrival. The response came almost immediately. Which passenger? The officer glanced down at the passport again and read the name. Across the counter, the traveler remained completely composed. Mercer watched the exchange with growing impatience. This is getting ridiculous, he muttered under his breath. But the radio crackled again before anyone could respond further. Repeat that name. The officer repeated it. Another pause followed. This one lasted longer. Then the voice on the radio returned, noticeably sharper. Stand by. Mercer shifted in his chair. What is this about? He asked again. No one answered. Instead, the officer beside him lowered the radio slowly and turned toward the computer screen Mercer had been using earlier. The verification window had refreshed. A new line of information had appeared. Mercer leaned forward to read it. The words were unmistakable. Diplomatic clearance confirmed. Below that line was another notification. Ambassadorial status verified. For a moment, Mercer simply stared at the screen. He blinked once, then again. That can't be right, he said quietly. The officer beside him didn't look surprised. In fact, he looked as though the confirmation had only validated something he had already suspected. He turned slowly toward Mercer. Sir, did you read the morning briefing packet carefully? He asked. Mercer didn't answer. His eyes were still fixed on the screen. The verification system continued updating. More information appeared. Official arrival status, diplomatic clearance codes, escort assignment details. Mercer's stomach tightened as he read the final line. Assigned border escort officer, Daniel Mercer. For several seconds, no one spoke. Across the counter, the traveler finally broke the silence. Officer Mercer, she said calmly. He looked up. Her expression hadn't changed. According to the briefing schedule, you were assigned to escort me through immigration this morning. Mercer felt the room tilt slightly around him. The passport that moments ago he had suspected might be fraudulent now sat on the desk, confirming something far more uncomfortable. The traveler wasn't just a legitimate passenger. She was a visiting ambassador, and he had spent the last several minutes questioning the authenticity of her credentials in front of multiple officers and travelers. The other officer slowly closed the passport and placed it carefully on the desk. Sir, he said quietly to Mercer, this is Ambassador Elena Alvarez. Mercer's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. A power dynamic in the room had completely flipped. Only minutes earlier, Mercer had been the authority controlling the inspection. Now he was the officer who had mistakenly detained a diplomatic official he had been assigned to assist. Before the story continues, pause for a moment. If you've ever seen authority misused or witnessed a moment where power suddenly backfired, share your thoughts in the comments. And if you follow stories about accountability, justice, and moments where the truth finally comes out, consider subscribing. These kinds of real-world reversals happen more often than people realize. Back at the inspection desk, Mercer finally found his voice. You're the ambassador? He asked. Ambassador Alvarez nodded slightly. Yes. The room remained silent for another long second. Then the radio crackled again. Supervisor is on the way to your location. Mercer looked down at the desk. For the first time since the inspection began, his earlier confidence was gone, because the situation he had created was no longer just a document check. It was now a diplomatic incident waiting to be explained.
The moment the word ambassador settled into the room, the atmosphere shifted in a way that was impossible to ignore. Just minutes earlier, Officer Mercer had been certain he was dealing with a suspicious traveler. The inspection had followed a familiar rhythm: question the document, challenge the story, verify the details.
But now the entire framework of that interaction had flipped. The passport on the desk was no longer evidence of a potential violation. It was proof that Mercer had just detained a visiting diplomatic official. And not just any official, an ambassador who had arrived in the country under formal government coordination. Mercer sat still, staring at the screen where the verification confirmation remained visible. The system continued displaying the diplomatic clearance codes, the official arrival notice, and the escort assignment schedule that now looked painfully clear. His own name was listed directly beside the ambassador's arrival. Assigned Border Escort Officer Daniel Mercer. Across the counter, Ambassador Alvarez remained composed. If she felt frustration, she didn't show it. Instead, she simply waited. The other officer in the room cleared his throat quietly. "Sir," he said to Mercer, "the supervisor will want a full explanation when he gets here." Mercer nodded slowly, but didn't speak. Behind the glass wall of the inspection area, a few travelers who had been passing through the terminal earlier were now standing near the corridor, watching the unusual scene unfolding at the secondary desk. Word had begun spreading among the nearby officers as well. One of them glanced toward Mercer's station, clearly sensing something unusual had happened. The quiet radio call for a supervisor had not gone unnoticed. Mercer finally looked up from the screen. His eyes met Ambassador Alvarez's again. For the first time since their interaction began, his voice had lost its earlier certainty. "Ambassador, I wasn't aware." She raised a hand gently, stopping him before he finished the sentence. "It's all right, Officer Mercer," she said calmly. The response was measured, professional, but it didn't erase what had already happened, because immigration inspections involving diplomatic officials followed very specific protocols, and one of those protocols was simple. Diplomatic credentials were not supposed to be publicly questioned or delayed without verified cause, especially not by the officer assigned to assist the arrival. The door to the inspection area opened again. This time, the man stepping through carried the presence of someone accustomed to walking into tense situations. Supervisor Grant. He had been working airport operations for over a decade and knew immediately when something unusual was unfolding. His eyes moved quickly across the room, first to Mercer, then to the other officer, then to the passport resting on the desk. Finally, he looked at Ambassador Alvarez. Recognition flashed across his face instantly. "Ambassador Alvarez," he said respectfully. Mercer felt his chest tighten. The confirmation from a supervisor made the mistake even more undeniable. Grant stepped closer to the desk. "I'm very sorry for the delay," he said to the ambassador. Then he turned toward Mercer. "What exactly happened here?" Mercer opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, the officer beside him slid the passport across the desk toward the supervisor. Grant glanced at the document, then at the screen, then back at Mercer. The look on his face said everything, because now the situation was no longer just an awkward misunderstanding between an officer and a traveler. It was an official incident involving a diplomatic guest of the government, and procedures required that incidents like this be documented, reviewed, and reported. Grant straightened slightly and reached for the small incident tablet clipped to his belt. "Officer Mercer," he said calmly, "I'm going to need you to walk me through exactly how this inspection started." And as Mercer began realizing what that request meant, the consequences of the last 20 minutes were only just beginning to unfold.
Supervisor Grant didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The quiet seriousness in his tone carried far more weight than anger would have. Officer Mercer sat back in his chair, suddenly aware that the situation had moved beyond a simple checkpoint interaction. What had begun as a routine passport inspection was now entering a completely different phase, one that involved documentation, reports, and a chain of accountability that stretched far beyond the airport terminal. Grant held the incident tablet in one hand while glancing between Mercer, the passport, and the ambassador standing calmly across the desk. "Let's start from the beginning," Grant said. Mercer cleared his throat. "She approached my checkpoint with the passport," he began carefully. "The seal looked unusual, and the verification system didn't immediately confirm it." Grant nodded slightly. "And that led you to secondary inspection?" "Yes." Grant tapped the tablet once, recording the sequence. The officer who had first recognized the passport stood nearby, arms folded now, watching the explanation unfold. "And at what point," Grant asked, "did you review the diplomatic arrival list from this morning's briefing?" Mercer hesitated. Grant noticed immediately. "You did receive the briefing packet at the start of your shift," he added cautiously. Mercer nodded slowly. "I skimmed it." Grant entered another note into the tablet. Across the counter, Ambassador Alvarez remained patient, though her gaze moved briefly toward the glass wall where several airport staff members had quietly gathered in the corridor. Word of the incident had clearly begun to spread. Diplomatic arrivals were handled carefully for a reason. Every country expected its ambassadors and official representatives to move through borders with professional courtesy and minimal disruption. When that process broke down, it could raise concerns not just within the airport, but at the governmental level. Grant understood that, which was why his next step followed procedure precisely. He turned toward the other officer. "Pull the body cam footage from Mercer's station," he said quietly. The officer nodded and stepped away to begin the request. Mercer felt a knot forming in his stomach. Body cam footage meant every moment of the interaction, from the first passport request to the secondary inspection, would now be reviewed in full detail. Grant continued typing notes into the tablet. "Ambassador Alvarez," he said respectfully, "I want to apologize for the delay and the inconvenience. We'll resolve this immediately." She nodded. "I appreciate that." Then Grant looked back toward Mercer. "This will be forwarded to internal review," he explained, "standard protocol when a diplomatic credential is challenged." Mercer swallowed slightly. He had heard of internal reviews before. Every officer had. Most were minor, simple clarifications of procedure, but some carried more serious consequences when the investigation determined that protocols had been ignored. Grant finished entering his notes and locked the tablet screen. "The important thing now," he continued, "is documenting exactly how this happened." The other officer returned a moment later. "Body cam retrieval has been requested," he said. Grant nodded. "Good." Then he turned once more toward Mercer. "Because once that footage and the system logs are reviewed," he added, "we'll know exactly where the process broke down." For Mercer, the realization was settling in quickly. What had started as a confident inspection decision was now becoming a documented case that would move through layers of oversight he could no longer control. And depending on what the review uncovered, the next conversation about this incident might not take place at the airport at all, but in an office where the consequences would be decided. Within 20 minutes, the situation at secondary inspection had been resolved operationally. Ambassador Elena Alvarez was escorted out of the inspection area with the courtesy and protocol that should have been provided the moment she arrived. Supervisor Grant personally walked her through the expedited clearance lane, bypassing the remaining procedures that had delayed her entry. Outside the checkpoint, a government vehicle assigned to diplomatic arrivals was already waiting. But the story didn't end when the ambassador left the terminal. In fact, for Officer Mercer, that was when the real process began. Because the moment a diplomatic incident occurs at an international border, it enters a completely different chain of review. Later that same afternoon, the internal systems finished compiling the complete record of the interaction.
The body cam footage from Mercer's station was retrieved, along with the computer logs from the passport verification system and the secondary inspection terminal. Those logs showed exactly how the inspection unfolded: the initial scan, the delay in the verification system, the escalation to secondary screening, and most importantly, the moment when Mercer chose to continue questioning the passport without reviewing the diplomatic arrival list provided at the beginning of his shift. When the footage was reviewed, it confirmed something else as well. At no point had the ambassador raised her voice or resisted the inspection. She had simply allowed the process to play out, which meant the entire delay and the public questioning of her credentials had come from one place: Mercer's decision-making during the inspection. Within 48 hours, the incident report reached the airport's internal review board. Situations involving diplomatic credentials were always taken seriously, not just because of protocol violations, but because they could affect international relations if handled improperly. The board reviewed the footage. They reviewed the verification logs. They reviewed the shift briefing records that confirmed the diplomatic arrival schedule had been distributed before Mercer began his shift. Their conclusion was clear. The delay had not been caused by a fraudulent document. It had been caused by a procedural oversight that escalated into an unnecessary confrontation. As a result, disciplinary action followed. Mercer was formally removed from diplomatic processing duties and placed under mandatory retraining for international protocol procedures. The incident was added to his service record, and his supervisors were required to conduct additional training across the unit to prevent similar situations in the future. Meanwhile, the airport issued a formal apology to Ambassador Alvarez through diplomatic channels. According to the official statement, she accepted the apology and continued her scheduled meetings without further incident. In the weeks that followed, the checkpoint procedures were quietly updated. Officers were reminded clearly that authority at the border comes with responsibility, especially when dealing with international officials whose status may not always be obvious at first glance. Because sometimes the difference between routine inspection and diplomatic embarrassment can come down to one overlooked detail and one moment of misplaced confidence. Before we close this story, we're curious about your thoughts. If you had been in Officer Mercer's position, what would you have done the moment you realized the traveler standing at your desk was the ambassador you were assigned to escort? Let us know in the comments. Stories like this remind us why accountability matters, especially when authority is involved. If you enjoy real cases where power is tested and the truth eventually surfaces, share this video with someone who finds these stories fascinating. And if you believe moments like this deserve to be documented and discussed, consider subscribing. Because every week we uncover stories that show exactly what happens when power meets accountability.